Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into this incredibly strange paradox of a top-secret Soviet rocket city that accidentally, and I mean completely by accident, birthed a wild, underground cultural revolution. So let's just jump right in. We're looking at a truly fascinating slice of history, where high-tech aerospace engineering collided head-on with teenage rebellion. To really set the stage, let's kick things off with a classic 1970s Soviet joke that perfectly captures our theme today. It goes like this. Question: who was Brezhnev? Answer: the insignificant Soviet political leader during the era of the Beatles and Alla Pugacheva. I mean, how brilliant is that? It perfectly highlights the sheer power of pop culture at the time. Even the absolute supreme leader of the Soviet Union was reduced to a punchline compared to the cultural titans of the day. We've got an incredible journey mapped out for us today. We'll be covering Ukraine's space-age pioneers, the lockdown of the closed rocket city, how it became a secret cultural laboratory, the rise of radio hooligans and rock, the KGB's resulting ideological confusion, and finally, the forging of a brand new identity. Part 1. Ukraine's space-age pioneers, engineering the cosmos. Because before we can even think about hitting the dance floor, we really need to understand the sheer, awe-inspiring scale of Ukraine's aerospace achievements. We're talking about pioneers like Sergei Korolev, Vladimir Chelomey, and Boris Potan, minds responsible for absolutely mind-blowing feats. Korolev, he designed the R-7 rocket and essentially took the Soviet Union to space with Sputnik and Vostok. Chelomey developed the world's first anti-ship cruise missiles and the massive UR-500 Proton rockets. And Potan, he literally invented fundamentally new electrowelding methods that made it possible to build structures in the vacuum of space and underwater. The sheer intellectual firepower concentrated here is just staggering. But building these world-changing ICBMs and space rockets required ultimate secrecy, which naturally brings us to a fascinating question. When you take thousands of these brilliant technical minds and completely isolate them to build weapons of mass destruction, what actually happens to the society trapped inside? That brings us to part 2, the closed rocket city, locking down Dnipropetrovsk. That question takes us directly to Dnipropetrovsk, the absolute epicenter of the Soviet military-industrial complex. This city was home to the massive Yuzhmash facility. This is where top-tier scientists and engineers worked around the clock to build the terrifying SS-18 ICBM, as well as massive space exploration rockets. And Yuzhmash wasn't just a factory, It was the sprawling, secretive complex employing thousands. They were designing the core hardware for the Soviet missile forces, and even manufacturing automatic space Sputniks for the International Space Program. Now, because of its immense strategic importance, the KGB officially closed Dnipropetrovsk to all foreigners in 1959. By doing this, they effectively sealed hundreds of thousands of highly educated engineers inside. 1959 marks the beginning of this unprecedented social experiment. No foreign tourists, no journalists, just a lockdown bubble of high-level Soviet science and industry. Moving to part 3, a secret cultural laboratory. The paradox of isolation. Now, you might be thinking this extreme isolation would create a sterile, perfectly obedient communist utopia, right? Well, actually, the exact opposite happened. The city morphed into a massive cultural laboratory. Strict KGB surveillance ended up colliding head-on with a youth population completely desperate for Western culture. So the crucial takeaway here is that by sealing the city off, the authorities accidentally created a pressure cooker. This young, highly technical population didn't just passively accept state-sanctioned culture. They started experimenting, literally blending Soviet reality with whatever tiny snippets of the outside world they could get their hands on. Part 4. Radio hooligans and rock, intercepting the West. Because think about it. When you lock thousands of young, brilliant engineering minds inside a city with radios, they don't just build rockets. They build illegal broadcast devices. By the 1970s, the KGB was tracking an astonishing 3,000 cases of illegal radio broadcasting annually from local amateur stations in the region. 3,000! Just let that number sink in. Thousands of high school and college students, many trained in the exact same institutes supporting the rocket industry, were building their own homemade transmitters. They became known as radio hooligans, completely polluting the official state airwaves with the heavy, forbidden beat of smuggled Western rock and roll. These kids were aggressively intercepting Western broadcasts. You had teenagers like 16-year-old Yevgeny Chaika writing directly to the BBC, famously saying, "It is impossible not to love the Beatles. Please send me chewing gum as well." The KGB actually intercepted thousands of these letters, sent from the closed region to stations in Canada, the US, and England. The authorities were desperately looking for deep anti-Soviet political plots. But overwhelmingly, these kids just wanted a copy of the Beatles' 19th Nervous Breakdown, a manual for new dances, and maybe some foreign pen pals. And this underground culture flourished right in plain sight. Just look at this amazing, authentic photograph of the local rock band Dnipro performing right in front of a giant portrait of Lenin. I mean, they were literally using official state facilities. Places like the Palace of Students and Komsomol-funded disco clubs were hosting these heavily Western-influenced electric events. Looking closely at these glimpses of that 1980 concert, it so brilliantly illustrates the bizarre, highly ironic collision of strict state ideology and forbidden youth culture. You literally have the ultimate symbol of Soviet communism staring down at musicians who are mimicking the capitalist West. It's a perfect visual of how the youth adapted to their environment, wearing the official uniform of Soviet loyalty while rabidly consuming the exact culture the state warned them against. Which leads us to part 5. The KGB's ideological confusion, fighting disco with Cossacks. As you can imagine, as this cultural rebellion swelled, the KGB and Communist Party ideologists were absolutely terrified and utterly confused about how to stop it. And it wasn't just music they were fighting. A KGB sweep in the first half of 1968 showed the city was consuming heavily forbidden material, largely smuggled from the western city of Lviv, and leading the pack, Ukrainian nationalist texts. There's a massive spike in confiscated literature here, 95 cases alone for Ukrainian nationalist material. We're talking pamphlets on Ukrainian history and poetry by Taras Shevchenko, highlighting the struggles of the Ukrainian Cossacks. The intellectuals of this rocket city were ravenous for alternative history, which made Lviv a massive headache for the local KGB. This ideological confusion absolutely peaked when authorities realized they couldn't force teenagers to listen to classical Russian composers instead of the Beatles or American disco. The state desperately wanted youth to have what they called cultured consumption, which in their minds meant Glinka, Tchaikovsky, and Soviet patriotism. But the actual youth, they were tuning into Voice of America, trading smuggled vinyl records, and reading imported nationalist poetry. The KGB was just completely caught in the middle of a massive demographic and cultural shift. So in a desperate and highly ironic twist, Soviet authorities actually started promoting Ukrainian national music, like Cossack songs, at disco clubs, simply to keep kids away from the heavily Americanized influences coming out of Lviv. Think about the logic here for a second. Earlier, the KGB had literally arrested students for showing too much interest in Ukrainian history. But by the late 1970s, to stop the spread of American disco, the Komsomol was actually ordering DJs in Dnipropetrovsk to play patriotic Ukrainian folk songs. They were literally weaponizing their own formerly suppressed history against Western pop culture. Wild, right? And finally, part 6, forging a new identity, the laboratory's legacy. This bizarre mishmash of influences inside the closed city had a profound, lasting impact on the region. The youth of Dnipropetrovsk effectively forged a completely new identity. They synthesized Soviet reality, illicit Western culture, and this strange state-sanctioned revival of Ukrainian nationalism. The environment became a perfect incubator. This specific generation grew up absorbing the sheer technical brilliance of the rocket factories, the rebellious electric sounds of Western rock, and a uniquely authorized version of their own national history. It's absolutely no coincidence that this very city ended up producing a massive percentage of the politicians who would go on to lead a post-Soviet independent Ukraine. It leaves us with this really provocative thought. How did an attempt to build a closed-off, homogeneous Soviet society inadvertently incubate the exact cultural forces that would help unravel it? Locking people inside a city to build weapons of mass destruction actually ended up giving them the cultural tools to ultimately dismantle the very system that confined them. They were supposed to be the ultimate obedient Soviet citizens, fully protected from the outside world. Instead, they became a dynamic cultural laboratory. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning the world around you, and we'll see you next time.